evening, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. As I'm sure we all know, 40 years ago this year, Argentina invaded the Falklands Islands, and the British government's response was to send a task force to liberate the islands and South Georgia. Tonight's speaker was the captain of a ship that was heavily involved in the Falklands conflict. So heavily involved, in fact, that his ship was destroyed as part of the conflict. His story is a remarkable one, and I'm sure you'll join with me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Captain Nick Tobin.
On the 19th of March, an Argentine entrepreneur called Constantino Davidov recruited some scrap metal merchants and sent them to South Georgia to dismantle the old whaling works at Grytviken, which they did. Unfortunately, they raised the Argentinian flag, which didn't go down terribly well, as you can imagine. And after the shenanigans, and you know about the shenanigans that went on between them and the 2nd of April, when a large Argentinian force landed on the Falklands and South Georgia. On the 3rd of April, the United Nations issued Resolution 502 demanding a cessation of hostilities. The British Foreign Minister, Lord Carrington, and his deputy, Peter Luce, resigned because they misread the signals. I won't go into the detail of what the signals were. US Secretary of State Al Haig continued shuttle diplomacy until the 30th of April and then ceased. Diplomacy had failed. Let me fast forward now to the end of June 1982, when a board of inquiry was convened to look into the circumstances surrounding the loss of my command, a Type 21 frigate called HMS Antelope, a spectacular casualty of the Falklands War. The inquiry began in Devonport. You don't need to read this, by the way. The inquiry began in Devonport not long after we'd returned, and in my view was conducted in a very insensitive and clumsy manner. I had no objections to it being set up. I expected this. It happens pretty regularly after major incidents. But I didn't like the way the board crucified my ship's company, bullied them, and reduced some to tears. I'd had enough. Oh, by the way, the inquiry took 6 weeks. I'd had enough, so I stopped the inquiry and called on the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, who'd set up the board in the first place. He listened carefully when I told him that the inquiry was often more stressful to my ship's company than the conflict that they'd just endured. He addressed me formally while he admonished me, gave me a right bollocking, for criticising the action of his appointees to the board. But just as I was leaving his office, somewhat chastened, but I hope having made my point, he called out by my Christian name, said, "Thank you, Nick, well done, now bugger off." Which I did. In September that year, I was in a new job, and the Board of Inquiry's findings were published to very select few, but they were fairly highly classified. And I was horrified to learn that they had found me, my second in command, and my Marine Engineer Officer to be negligent in the performance of some of our duties. Why? You may well reasonably ask. Well, I'll tell you, but not just yet. I first want to set the scene and give you a flavour of Antelope's activities in the Atlantic until that fateful day on the 24th of May, 1982, when she sank beneath the freezing waves of San Carlos water. On the 2nd of April, I was at anchor in Portland Harbour, At dawn, my communications yeoman woke me and said, "Sir, I've got a signal from the Commander-in-Chief. It's very highly classified." I said, "Please read it to me." He said, "I can't. I'm not clear to decipher it." I was now wide awake, leapt out of my bunk, opened my safe, pulled out what's called a one-time code, and deciphered the message, which said, "Return to port with all dispatch." That means very quickly. "Store and ammunition for war, and be prepared for operations in the South Atlantic." Wow, I thought. Weighed anchor and sped westwards to Devonport, Plymouth, our home port, at maximum speed, probably scattering fishing boats and yachts as we went. In 30 hours, we were reported ready to sail, and on the 5th of April, I sailed from Plymouth in company with HMS Attaché. Commander Chris Craig was the captain, and we headed southwestwards. We rendezvoused with the carrier group and exercised. On the 11th of April, I was detached. So I trod water around about Madeira, and I was told to await the amphibious group. I had a little bit of time to spare. So what did we do? Well, first of all, it was Easter Sunday. So I held service, as commanding officers are in ships do when there's no chaplain embarked. And afterwards, we had, guess what, an Easter egg hunt. And the competition was between those that work on the upper deck and those that live in the bowels of the ship, the engineers. The stokers won. And some of their offerings are probably still melted in my ship all those way south. But it was good fun and cheered us up a bit. On the 12th of April, I was ordered to take command of 7 ships of the amphibious group. 5 landing ships logistic, like Sir Lancelot here, and 2 other escorts, a store ship and a tanker. Now, you may be interested to know that these ships were crewed mostly by locally enlisted Hong Kong Chinese seamen. And my lads reckoned that I was probably commanding the largest Chinese fleet ever to sail the Atlantic. But only Confucius would know the answer. But more seriously, these ships were carrying some 1,800 commandos, paratroopers, gunners, all their kit and caboodle, and 12 helicopters. And it was a hell of a task for me as what's known as a private ship to take, not so much to take charge of them, but look after all their problems. There were operational problems. There were logistic problems. We ran out of Chinese food, would you believe? There were water problems. These ships couldn't actually make the water they needed. So I had to find a water tanker. Lots and lots of things kept me really rather busy. But before we headed further south, I decided to invite all the masters of these ships to lunch. And I gave them a really good lunch so that I could see the whites of their eyes and they could see the whites of mine, because I knew that many of the orders I'd been giving wouldn't be very popular. Southwards we went via Ascension Island, where the amphibious groups reconfigured so they get all the kit and caboodle in the right area, in the right sort of order. And I stayed there for 10 days. I was appointed as the guard ship because there was a submarine threat from Argentine submarines. And during that time, apart from exercising and doing a few media interviews, I chased off a couple of Argentinian merchant ships who had been diverted to see what was going on. And when I pointed my big gun at them, they disappeared quite quickly. We sailed on the 1st of May, and on the 2nd of May, as many of you will remember, HMS Conqueror, our nuclear submarine, sank the Belgrano with a loss of 323 lives. We didn't cheer. Who would at such a heavy loss? We were shocked, but it was war. We continued southwards And about 400 miles out of the Falkland Islands, I was told to hand over command of my 7 ships and hand them over to HMS Antrim. Captain Brown Young was the captain. Because this fine ship had to replace Sheffield, who'd been bombed or exercised on the 4th of May. In turn, I took charge of RFA Tidespring, a tanker, but now also a temporary prison ship, harbouring about 180 Argentine prisoners of war. At this time, as we were heading north with a groan, the captain of Hermes, Lynn Middleton, nicknamed us the ping pong ball. And this slide gives you a brief idea of some of the distances that we travelled. Tidespring was also looking after the displaced scrap metal merchants I mentioned earlier. I incarcerated Captain Alfredo Astis in my ship, not the tanker, and he was the commander of the Argentine Special Forces group that took South Georgia on the 2nd of April. And on my ship too, that's South Georgia, by the way. On my ship, I looked after the British Antarctic survey team. No, not these penguins. 2 wildlife documentary filmmakers from Anglia Television. In the background is Cindy Buxton. In the foreground is Annie Price. And would you believe 2 hand-reared South Georgian pintail ducks. Now, the ducks seemed very happy in their temporary home in the sick bay bath, whilst the women enjoyed the comforts of my day cabin, and I have to stress my day cabin. Astis was a nasty, clever piece of work, wanted in Sweden for crimes, and also in France for crimes. And when he was on board Antrim, he'd fashioned a weapon out of the bed springs and quite seriously injured one of his guards. I would have none of that, of course. And so I stripped his temporary cabin prison bare and placed outside a series of very large stokers armed with a pickaxe helmet. And I spoke to Astis, who professed not to speak English, by the way, and said that if this chap would obey my orders, and if he put 1 foot outside the door, he would be restrained with appropriate force. We heard not a squeak from him, but we always fed and watered him and gave him exercise once a day. The prisoners in Tidespring had to be split into 3 groups. The conscripts were put into a deeper hold. The special forces, who were highly trained, very well motivated, they were in 1 torpedo magazine, and the survivors from the Argentine submarine, the Santa Fe, who had been disabled in South Georgia, in the 2nd torpedo magazine, not exactly comfortable. A tanker is not the ideal ship to carry prisoners, as you will appreciate. Now, that 3,000-mile journey back to Ascension made us face what I would call unrehearsed realities of war, including trying to meet the terms of the Geneva Convention for the treatment of prisoners of war, dealing with delegates from the International Committee of the Red Cross who'd been flown on board to investigate complaints by the Argentinian government that we weren't handling the prisoners properly. Quite a few media interviews, and last but not least, giving some tender-loving care, nautical tender-loving care, to 25 British civilians who had been very badly handled whilst they'd been in charge of, not in charge, but also in South Georgia. And that 3,000-mile journey ended when we didn't hit Ascension, we disembarked all passengers and prisoners at Ascension. And this photograph, taken by Cindy Buxton, is taken just before we reached Ascension, and it shows the club swinger, leading physical trainer Williams, seemingly in charge by the Polaris compass, while the officers gossip by the chart table. I'm the chap with the bearing. Don't we look young? Well, we were young. I was the second oldest man in the ship at 37. The average age of my ship's company was under 21. We headed south in company with HMS Ambuscade, another Type 21, but poor Peter Moss had serious engine problems, so I left him behind. I detached him so he could find his own way down a little bit more slowly. We headed further south at quite good speed. On the 21st of May, the day of the main amphibious landings, we, Antelope, just entered the total exclusion zone, which is a zone about 200 miles, no, it wasn't about, it's actually 200 miles centred on the Falkland Islands. And I decided to inject a little bit more realism into our preparations for war or for action. And I relayed the main air battle radio circuit over my ship's main broadcast. And it was harrowing and horrifying to hear real-time reports of action and of casualties. 5 Royal Navy ships were damaged that day, and our sister ship, HMS Ardent, was bombed and sank with a loss of 22 lives, and we knew many of them. I then joined the task force and was ordered to take RFA Stromness, seen here, and the North Sea ferry, the Norland, seen here in Bomb Alley, and those are real bombs going off, because those 2 ships carried vital supplies to resupply 3 Commander Brigade, that was the Royal Marines and Royal Marine Commandos, and the Paras, who had established a beachhead in San Carlos water. That afternoon, I launched my Lynx helicopter, not this one, but like this one, armed with air-to-surface missiles, to search and attack an Argentine freighter who'd been seen in Falkland Sound. And you can see there, that's Port San Carlos, for those who are short of sight. Post-attack reconnaissance revealed that his mission had been a success. He damaged the freighter. But as he was, and we thought, yippee, that's good, our Antelope's tail was up. But as he was travelling, returning up the Sound, he reported being overtaken by 4 Argentinian A4 Skyhawks. Our tension mounted when they crossed the mouth of San Carlos water. Sorry about the quality of this slide, where they split into 2 pairs. The first pair, that's the orange line, attacked us from the east. We fired everything that we could at them, our guns, our missiles, and small arms. But our fire control and target indication radars were masked or blinded by the proximity of high ground, so all weapon systems had to be laid, i.e. aimed, by eye. We repulsed the raid, and we seriously damaged one of the A4s, who flew back to his base in Argentina. Before we could draw breath, the second pair attacked. That was the, go back a bit, that's the green line, but I think you've got that one. And again, we fired what we could. We hit one aircraft, the lead aircraft, with shells from our 20mm cannon. But before he hit our mainmast and disintegrated into a great ball of flame into the sea beyond. But before his fiery end, he released 2 bombs. One missed and the other ricocheted off the sea and entered the engine room, just above the engine room there. That's about a meter hole. We held our breath, but nothing happened. The bombs didn't explode. The ever impartial BBC had failed to alert the enemy that they should adjust their fuses for a low-level attack. But we didn't have much time to think about it because of the third attack, probably the surviving aircraft from the first, whose bomb, as you can see again, hit us this time below the bridge. I took stock. Those bombs had killed and injured several people, including 18-year-old Mark Stevens, and had caused a lot of damage in the ship and completely wiped out both our gyros, which are quite important for various activities in the ship. I decided we needed to anchor to sort ourselves out. So I steamed deeper into San Carlos water and anchored near Ajax Bay. I called for bomb disposal assistance, and 2 Army bomb disposal officers embarked. They had just been to this lovely ship, HMS Argentinian. Captain Kit Lehman was the captain. They just defused a bomb. They arrived on board, and we discussed all the options, including jettisoning the bombs overboard. And by the way, the bombs were made in Britain. One was olive green, like the ones here, and the other was black, both made in 1972, clearly part of an earlier export defence sales drive, and now something which one might call an own go. The bomb disposal team made 3 attempts to defuse the bomb using a device known as a rocket wrench, which works rather like a Catherine wheel and is designed to spin off the fusing mechanism. It didn't work. We had a quick conflab again, and they said, we're going to use a de-armor, which is a fairly crude device. And you set a charge behind a chisel that again is supposed to cut the fusing mechanism before it can activate the detonator. And they told me that this device had never failed them in their 35 years of bomb disposal experience. I trusted them. They set off the charge of the cutter. We waited, we heard the thump, heard the thump, but about 20 seconds later, an enormous explosion rent the air, killing one of the bomb disposal team instantly and tearing an arm off his colleague. Miraculously, my engineer officer and one chief petty officer who'd accompanied the team somehow managed to escape serious injury. The bomb had created huge damage and blew out a 10-meter hole in the ship's starboard side, and fierce fires spread throughout the ship very, very rapidly. The force of the explosion had also severed our ability to fight the fire, which is called the fresh seawater main. It had also completely cut our hydraulics and our electrical supplies, so we didn't have much power. We did what we could with portable equipment, and some landing craft that had been standing by too also helped, but there was no way they could control the conflagration. It was getting hotter and hotter. I was worried that the temperatures were probably around the bomb, probably about 500 degrees centigrade, but who knows exactly. I was worried that the heat would sympathetically detonate the other bomb and also the ship's own ammunition. And the ship's company, who were on the flight deck, found it difficult to breathe without breathing apparatus, as you can imagine, and pretty toxic stuff. So I decided that it was time to abandon ship. I was on the bridge, cut off the rest of the ship, and the decks behind me had cracked open and flames were raging through. It was time to go. Landing craft and other ships, seaboats, came and took the ship's company that were from the quarterdeck and the flight deck, and they then picked me up in one of these landing craft. And I was the last to leave, I think, doesn't matter where I was exactly, and I climbed down a knotted rope into a landing craft. And about 5 minutes after I embarked in that landing craft, my ship's upper deck torpedo and missile magazines blew up. We'd escaped not a moment too soon. I ordered this landing craft to head towards HMS Plymouth, which is the nearest ship underway, Plymouth being commanded by David. I'll get his name in a moment. And I needed to use his secure communication equipment so I could tell the Admiral what was happening and what was going on. And I got on board, I went to the bridge, and Pentreath is his name, David Pentreath, sorry to forget his name. And he asked me if I wanted to drink. And I said, that would be jolly nice, thank you. And in no time flat, his steward came up with a large black cup of hot coffee. I took one gulp and choked most of it out, because of course it'd been laced with rum. But I needed to get on board Fearless, captained by, in fact, Commodore Michael Clapp was the commander of amphibious warfare, where most of my ship's company, who had been dispersed around the ships in sank water, I wanted to reassemble there and needed to find out whether there were any further losses than that. And the answer was, no, they weren't. We stayed on board for another 12 hours or so, and it was tragic to watch the end of one's ship. You can see the size of the hole. That's the 10-meter diameter hole. And most of us stood up throughout the night watching her die until the following morning, when she broke in two and sank in an enormous gush of steam and smoke, with her bow and stern remaining afloat for a little longer, sort of V-shaped gesture of defiance. I thank God that most of us had survived that exacting, frightening, exciting, but totally unforgettable day. It was small comfort to know that we had destroyed 2 enemy aircraft, but Antelope had borne the brunt of the air attacks on the 23rd of May, which meant that the Argentinians arguably had misdirected their bombs because it gave our supply ships the opportunity to land, resupply the commando forces there. We were transferred to that wonderful North Sea ferry, Norland, normally plying between Hull and Rotterdam, who took us to South Georgia. It was good to be out of the firing line. And at South Georgia, we embarked in the QE2, together with the survivors from HMS Ardent and survivors from HMS Coventry, and who'd been bombed and sank on the 25th of May. And the ship took only 11 days to sail from South Georgia to Southampton, which was pretty quick. During that time, we decompressed, I think is the more modern term, worked out what we were to do next, got our thoughts in order, agonized over whether we had done things right or wrong, and I had 2 fellow commanding officers with me, Alan West, now Admiral Lord West, and David Hart Dyke, who was quite badly injured. And we discussed the whys and the ifs and the what and the whethers. But I was still pretty confident that I had made the right decisions with the information I had at the time. We arrived in Southampton on the 11th of June, 3 days before the end of the war. We were greeted by Her Majesty the Queen Mother in the Royal Yacht, 2 Hunter jet aircraft whose low flypast gave our hearts a different sort of flutter, 2 or 3 budding Erica Roads And those of you who may remember, during that rugby match that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Miss Erica Rose shrieked at half-time. But most important of all, our families were there. And that was a huge comfort to us. More about comfort a little later. Antelope had sunk, but our thoughts and memories survived. Now, let me go back to where we started. Why had the board found us, or some of my command team, to have been negligent? Well, apparently we hadn't prepared the ship properly for bomb disposal. I disputed that. We hadn't appreciated the extent of damage likely to be caused by secondary explosions. Difficult to do. I hadn't liaised effectively with the bomb disposal team. That was rubbish. I should have placed more damage control and firefighting personnel closer to the unexploded bomb. And crucially, I should have jettisoned the bomb overboard after the first 3 disposal attempts had failed. Well, after a 6-week board of inquiry, it was pretty easy, if you will, for the board forensically to have come to those technical findings. But it had become very clear to me during the inquiry that I couldn't expect these armchair warriors, none of whom had ever been in action before, to quite understand what it's like in battle. The sounds, the fury, the heat, the stress, the loss of life. I wondered how they would have reacted had they been in my position. And I still felt that I had made the right decision because the bomb disposal team had actually been defused successfully in situ in HMS Argentinian. That, my decision, killed and injured more people and lost a valuable warship at a crucial part of the war, I regret. But had I done what the board suggested I should have done, I reckon that the bomb may well still have exploded and the outcome would have been much the same, except the loss of life would have been much, much greater. And I did not want a repeat of Arden's tragic turn. Interestingly, not long afterwards, the Commander-in-Chief dismissed the findings of negligence, and I was very relieved that my ship's contribution to the Falklands campaign wasn't overshadowed by a series of courts-martial, not least my own, with their attendant share of shame and dishonour. I reckon I was vindicated. 14 years later, 1996, BBC Two television programme, where John Phillips, the surviving bomb disposal officer, told about 1 million viewers that it would be madness to try to jettison such an unstable bomb overboard. I didn't know it was that unstable at the time that he was defusing it. I knew it was unstable. Any bomb would be rattling through a ship, bouncing off decks and bulkheads and things like that. And even had he told me at the time, I doubt whether I would have changed my mind and to order his team to try and defuse the bomb. It didn't matter to me. I'd rather come to terms with the result of the board of inquiry and got on with life. And by that time, I had retired. Now, let me end this little talk on a slightly more positive note. Gongs. John Phillips was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His colleague, Staff Sergeant Jim Prescott, the posthumous Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. 2 of my ship's company were mentioned in dispatches, Midshipman Mark Fletcher and Chief Petty Officer Pedro Porter. And the leading seaman Warren, Bunny Warren, of course, who shot down the enemy A4 aircraft and saved the life of 2 or 3 members of the fire party, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. And unbeknown to me at the time, and not until only about 2 years ago, my late wife Josie received a letter of commendation from the Commander-in-Chief for her work in support of Antelope's families. Guns. This is a 20mm cannon. It's a World War II type thing. Worked very well in our case. This one was resurrected in the deep by Clarence divers, fitted in a sister ship called HMS Avenger, and used in action 10 days after she was cleaned up, or it was cleaned up. And the captain, Hugo White, had a plaque put on the gun which said Antelope's Avenger. We were chuffed. Plates. This is a deck plate in Hereford Cathedral on the 19th of June this year. 2 deck plates were also brought up by divers. I gave one to our affiliated city, Hereford, and the other one to our affiliated regiment, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, whose headquarters are in the Tower of London, and is fitted to the entrance to the officers' mess. So every time anyone enters or leaves the mess, they either step over or step on antelope. So bits of antelope may be dead, but bits of antelope live on. Finally, the ducks. My wife and I went to the Wetlands and Wildfowl Wetlands Trust at Slimbridge about 2 years after the war to find out what had happened. Had they survived? Well, yes, not only had they survived, but they had thrived, as had we. Joy to us all. That's my daughter. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Nick for a fascinating and may I say, quite moving talk, actually. Really looking into some extraordinary events. Obviously, now I'm very happy to take questions. I'm going to ask Nick if, when anyone asks a question in the room, for the benefit of our Zoom viewers, of whom there are many tonight, Nick, if you could try and repeat the question, because they won't hear the room audio so well.
Sure.
So I shall hand back over to him.
Please, anything you like. I won't be able to answer all of it, but I'll try. Tony.
Captain Tobin, do you think lessons have been learned for the conduct of future boards of inquiry?
One of my listeners at a previous talk I gave had read every single Board of Inquiry report, and he thought that Antelopes was the most damning. It was unsympathetic, and I don't know whether or not other boards of inquiry will have been as bad or as well. The Commander-in-Chief, no doubt, will have probably had words with the president of the board, who was a very senior captain. I was a pretty junior commander. But that very senior captain never got promoted, and I've never spoken to him again. I have no wish to know it reveal his name.
So I think we have a question from one of the online viewers. What was the air defence missile system? Am I right in thinking another vessel suffered an air defence issue?
We, in Antelope, had a rather ancient surface-to-air missile system called SEACAT, and other warships of our class also armed with the surface-to-air missile called SEACAT. It worked with us briefly. Other ships, the Type 22s in the task force, were armed with Seawolf, which was much more modern and much better missile system and worked pretty well. And I certainly think they had a few kills. Those are the only 2 missile systems that we had on board our ships. The Army had Rapier, and that was a similar sort of system to the Seawolf system, but the Rapier took a little bit of time to get going. They had problems setting it up. But once they did set it up, it proved quite effective.
Any questions in the room?
Captain, thank you very much for your extraordinary talk. Can you say more about Captain Estes and what he was actually accused of and what happened to him afterwards in Argentine democracy? May have put him on trial, perhaps.
Could you repeat a bit of the question?
The question is, what happened to Captain Estes? Well, I disembarked him when I got to Ascension, to HMS Leeds Castle. And as he was entering the gangway, or one of the gangway of Leeds Castle, one of Leeds Castle's sailors tripped him up, so it fell down a hatch. I was very cross indeed, because that's not the way to handle prisoners. I believe, I'm not absolutely sure, that as Tiz was repatriated, I think in the middle of June, he was kept in fairly solitary confinement. The commander of the British forces, Ascension Island, had to use some legal terminology to arrest him properly, because he was wanted not. He wasn't a normal prisoner of war, but he was a very special prisoner of war. I think he was taken back, and I believe he's still under lock and key. Good. That's what I understand, but don't quote me. I think there was another.
You say those bombs that went into the ship were made in the UK from a decade before. Why did, when it came to defusing them, went into resort to going in the UK and say, how do you do it?
The question is, why did we, because the bombs were made in the United Kingdom, why didn't we find out from the United Kingdom how to defuse them? And the answer to the question is, the Argentinians changed the fusing mechanisms.
There's another question online from from David Bolston. Were there equally demanding, I think you touched on this actually, were there equally demanding inquiries into the other commanding officers who lost their ships, and what were their outcomes?
There were equally trying inquiries. Ardent's, Coventry's, Sheffield's, and Atlantic Conveyor all had their boards of inquiry. They all lasted about 6 weeks, and they were probably, I don't believe that they were as painful as ours, but I don't really know. Alan West, a colleague from way back, said that his didn't appear to be quite as bad as mine. And David Hartdyke, Coventry, similarly, we've seen each other obviously from time to time. So that's really all I can say about that.
Another question here, is anyone else in the room?
Yeah. Assuming that you've been through a phase of sea training before you actually went to Falklands, did you feel that you were fully prepared to go into action in Falklands based on the training you received?
The question is, did we have sea training before we deployed south, and was it good enough? Well, while I was at Portland, I was in the middle of what was called continuation operational sea training, where you are really tested by the fleet staff in what was called flag officer sea training. We weren't fully worked up. We'd already been through basic operational sea training, so this was what was called continuation sea training, as I've just said. And on our way down, we reckoned that when we got to the Falklands, we were as ready as we could have been. Other people have criticised the Admiral for deploying Antelope into San Carlos water so soon after we got there. But the reason that he did that was because of me. By that time, I'd been in command of 70 ships. I was basically in charge. And I was told when I got to the group, well, just before I got to the main force, which was about 400 miles east of the Falkland Islands, to receive yet another airdrop from the ubiquitous C-130s, which were very, very useful for us. We needed them. And I said to the Admiral, I didn't like that idea. I was quite happy to do it, but I needed fuel. I was desperately low on fuel. And my proposal, which he accepted, was he send another frigate to do the airdrop. So the other frigate was Alacrity, whom I'd sailed from Devonport with on the 5th of April. So Alacrity went to pick up the airdrop, and I took over what Alacrity was going to do, which was to escort the Norland and the Stromness into San Carlos water. Now, whether or not Alacrity would have suffered the same fate as Antelope, I don't know, but they were more worked up, having been in the islands for a while, providing naval gun passport and various other things. I thought we were as ready as we could be.
There's a question from Peter on Zoom. Do you think that if the Argentinians had been able to get hold of more exocets, the outcome of the war might have been different?
The answer is possibly, but I don't know. One of the problems that some people may have thought of is that exocet has a kill switch. And I believe, but I don't know, that we asked the French for this kill switch, but that was turned down. So that was a fairly major diplomatic debate between ourselves and the French. Mitterrand declined to give that kill switch. So I know that's hearsay. It's not, from my knowledge, at all. Yeah.
We know that Chile played quite a substantial part in assisting Britain. Would you say anything about that? At least I think that would be.
No. The answer was, did Chile play a part in the Falklands War? I don't know the answer to that. There are lots of theories that helicopters flew and this, that, and the other. There probably was some sort of accommodation, but I don't know the details. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
Thank you.
One more on Zoom, and then we'll come to the wrap up. It's not, of course, it's not the job of the armed services to consider the political aspects, but were the general pros and cons of the conflict discussed in the task force?
Not by me, not by any individual commanding officer, and I doubt very much whether the Commander-in-Chief Fleet, who was briefing or being briefed by Admiral Woodward at Ascension, where they got into the whys and the wherefores, the yeses of the political side. No, politics was kept out of it.
Captain Tobin, the Committee of Inquiry was very focused on the bomb and the bomb disposal. Didn't they really consider the risk that your ship had been put into right at the front of the battle, and the actions of your crew to save the ship? Because you obviously have some very brave people protecting the boat, and I would have thought that should have been in your favour with the committee, as opposed to overall some form of admonishment for something that wasn't your failure. You'd actually done your very best to the captain of the ship to save your vessel and your crew. And I think that deserves some significant praise for your bravery. That's my view of I was on that committee. I wouldn't have been able to cope with that judgment if I'd been the chairman of that.
The question is, did the board consider the ship's company and what they had actually done to try and save the ship by extinguishing the fires? The answer is they probably did, but their job was to look forensically to find out the lessons learnt, rather than what went right, but not what went wrong. And for this, they were pretty brutal. The report is probably 70, 80 pages, I can't remember exactly, and it's very critical. It did actually state that the ship, most of the ship's company did particularly well. One of the problems, which I will mention, is that when you go into action, you close the ship down like a drum. You close all the doors, turn off all of it, so you are tight, you are watertight, airtight, and NBCE tight, nuclear tight, if you will. But before the bombs were being disposed, I ordered some hatches to be opened so that any explosion, they're called vent routes, would vent the force of the bomb. Well, unbeknown to me, because I had other things on my mind, one of my chief petty officers was walking or running from A to B and saw the hatches that had been opened, but hadn't been privy to the argument or the debate and the order that I had them opened. He closed them. And that's one of the reasons why the ship blew up in the way that it did. And I put that particular chief's actions down to stress, because he was still in his mind thinking we are at action, and the action stations, you are in position Zulu Alpha, which is you just close all the doors and seal all the doors. But the board did take into consideration some of the actions of the ship's company. And in fact, as I said, they found me to be negligent, is an interesting matter. I still said to them that, look, they defused successfully a bomb in Argonaut. It follows that they could easily defuse a bomb successfully in Antelope. And that was the way my mind worked. But after Antelope's blown up, all other unexploded bombs were jettisoned overboard. So that was the lesson that they learned as far as Antelope was concerned.
It's a question from Peter Mann on Zoom. Would you consider that Antelope was under-equipped and undergunned for the job you were given?
The warships that took part in the Falklands War were mainly designed to fight in the Atlantic, in open water. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that our target indication and fire control radars were masked, i.e. blinded, by high ground. Radar doesn't see through land. The ships were not under-equipped for the task, although if we'd been able to fight the war in open sea, it would have been completely different.
Anyone last question in the room? And then I know Captain Tobin wants to make some closing remarks. So any final question? I have one actually, my own. Can you briefly say what your career was after the Falklands, your naval career?
I was promoted to captain on the dry list and not the wet list, which means that I didn't go to sea again. And that's the one thing I really, really regret. What had happened is, even though the Commander-in-Chief had dismissed the findings of negligence, I think a little bit of the mud stuck, which is a shame. I didn't necessarily want to be admiral. So when I retired at the age 50, at the top of the seniority as a captain, I received the brown envelope with a window with a P45 in it, rather than the blue envelope with green ink saying, "Welcome to the club."
Okay, so
this is the first HMS Antelope, launched in 1546 and fought in the Armada against the Spanish. And in the Armada, there were two Antelopes, a warship and a merchant ship, who was taken up from trade, so there's nothing new. I want to just conclude by giving you a very short reflection. You've just heard a glimpse, a tiny glimpse of naval history from my perspective, from my ship, peripheral to the greater things that were going on in the Falklands at the time, but nonetheless a history. Other ships, commandos, battalions, and squadrons, air squadrons, will have all had their tale to tell. What we all had was the support back home, from Her Majesty the Queen to the Cabinet, except Francis Pym had a bit of a wobble, I gather, to you lot, and of course our loved ones, who must have suffered agonies, waiting to hear news of their sons, their brothers, their husbands, fighting a war 8,000 miles away at the bottom of the world. They wondered, would they ever see them again? Well, as you know, 255 people were killed, so they didn't see them again. As far as Antelope was concerned, the uncompromising support that we received from our families in thought, in prayer, and the odd letter that got through was absolutely immeasurable. And in my reckoning, our families were the unsung heroes. Thank you.